Hello, lovely souls, and welcome to Emily Whispers. I'm Emily, and I'm so happy you decided to join me tonight. I'm curious, where are you listening from? Drop a comment and say hello. I love connecting with each of you. If these little moments bring you peace, please like and subscribe so we can share more of them together. Now find your cozy spot. Wrap yourself in a blanket if you like. Take a slow, gentle breath, and let's drift into tonight's story. The old Sheridan Peak Station was not listed on any public hiking guides or updated ranger maps. It was not the kind of place you stumbled across by accident. It was a place you were sent to. A place that carried a kind of weight the forest seemed eager to keep hidden. When the regional office decided that it finally needed a decommissioning survey, my name was pulled. My supervisor, a man who had worked through decades of strange calls in the mountains of Wyoming and Montana, spoke to me with the tired caution of someone who had already lost things to these woods. "Thompson," he said as he slid the rusted keys across the desk, "sometimes what stays in the forest is meant to stay buried. Just take the inventory and make a report. In and out." The silence that followed was longer than the words, a silence that held more warning than anything he would admit out loud. I was still young then, still eager to prove myself. I told myself it would only be a short assignment. A month alone, no more. Hike the last stretch of trail, check the building, and file the paperwork. The mountains had a way of breaking up the endless routine, and I wanted that solitude. The drive to the trailhead was brutal. The service truck groaned and slipped as the gravel gave way to dirt. On one side of me rose a sheer wall of granite, and on the other fell a dark drop into a forest, so thick the light could not reach the ground. The higher I went, the weaker the sunlight became, fading in and out as though filtered through an old film. At the end of the road, where the map said a marker should be, I found only a half-rotten signpost smothered in moss. The letters were nothing but faint scars in the wood. I left the truck behind and took my pack. The trail rose steeply for nearly a mile, weaving through giant ferns and dripping spruce. By the time I reached the station, the fog had begun to cling to the trees in slow, pale ribbons. The building sat slumped into the hillside as though it had grown from the ground. Its wooden walls were gray and splitting, its roof patched with metal sheets of different colors. Inside was one dark room, a cot, a cold wood stove, and shelves crowded with equipment so old the dust gave it no shape at all. The smell was a mixture of damp paper, old soil, and something sharp I could not place. That night, I sat by a small fire in the stove and ate a meal from a foil packet. The rain started slow, pattering against the patched roof until it blended into the sound of the forest breathing around me. Sleep came heavy, and when I woke the next morning, the fog outside was so dense it pressed against the windows like a living thing. On the second afternoon, I noticed it. A faint scent in the air, light and sweet, drifting in from the woods. I stood on the porch, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. By the next day, the scent returned again, stronger, as if carried by invisible hands. It was floral, almost cloying, and it always came from the same stretch of trees. By the fourth morning, the smell arrived before the fog had even lifted. It was so strong it burned my eyes. I walked to the back door, and there on the railing was a single white blossom, balanced as if placed with care. It was shaped like an orchid, its petals smooth and pale, but I knew no orchid grew in these mountains. I felt the hair on my arms lift. I had not brought it there. I tried the trail back down to my truck, but the path was wrong. A fresh fall of pine blocked the way, massive, its bark dripping with a sap that smelled exactly like the floral scent in the air. My compass spun without reason, the needle trembling in my palm. I returned to the station and locked the door. In the evening, I opened a filing cabinet and found an old, narrow notebook tucked into the back. Its pages were nearly brittle, but the ink was still there. If you smell it, do not answer. That was the first line, written in a steady hand. Each page was filled with warnings. It will look like a gift. Do not let it speak your name. If the samples glow, run. The last entry was written in broken lines, hurried and shaking. Do not let it follow you home. Outside, something heavy dragged across the porch. The sound moved slowly, circling the cabin, pausing to lean against the doorframe. I stayed silent, my hand resting on my service pistol, and tried not to breathe. By the next day, the rain was pouring without end. The trail was impassable, the mud swallowing each step I took. I returned to the cabin, and the smell came with me. That night, I heard voices. They first rose in the faint static of the shortwave radio, then grew clearer until they pressed against the walls. They used my last name, stretching it out, twisting it, as though the voice was learning how to speak. I tried the radio again. For a moment, it was only static, and then, in the middle of it, I heard my own voice. It was reading from my log entry that morning. No signs of wildlife. The words came back to me broken and slow, like something repeating what it had just learned. I turned the radio off and shoved it into the drawer. At dusk, I checked the room. The plant sample I had pressed in my notebook was no longer flat. It was standing upright in the center of the floor, its edges glowing with a pale light from inside. I ran. I left the stove, the cot, the notes. I stumbled through the brush, slipping, cutting my hands, my boots filling with mud. I did not stop until I reached the old logging road where a set of headlights caught me. An older man drove me down the mountain without speaking, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. When I called my supervisor later that night, his voice was small. There is a reason that Post was never brought back into service, Thompson. Not all stations are meant to be lived in. Months later, I returned with a regional director. The station was gone. Not burned, not collapsed. Gone. In its place was a mound of moss, as though the ground had swallowed it. The director frowned and said that this part of the mountains had a way of shifting. The file was closed that day, but I have not forgotten. When the weather turns and storms crawl across the ridges, I still smell that sweet perfume. Sometimes when I wake in the night, I find things of mine sitting in the doorway, arranged carefully, as if placed there while I slept. A compass, a knife, my boots. The forest remembers who tries to lay claim to it. If you ever find yourself alone in a station you did not build, and the woods speak your name back to you, do not answer. Leave the gifts where you find them. Some mountains do not let go. In the remote wilderness of Wyoming's Bighorn Mountains, where jagged peaks pierce a vast, empty sky and pristine alpine meadows stretch for miles without a single sign of human habitation, a group of seasoned campers discovered that the greatest threat in the mountains isn't always the harsh environment or dangerous wildlife. Sometimes it's other humans who have decided that the isolation of the wilderness gives them license to terrorize anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path. This is the account of what happened to our group during what was supposed to be a peaceful weekend camping trip in October 2015. When we encountered individuals who transformed our remote campsite into a scene of psychological warfare that would haunt us for years. Afterward, our group consisted of two couples, my wife Anna and me, and our friends Liam and Chloe, both in their early 30s. I was an experienced outdoorsman who had been camping and hiking in Wyoming's backcountry for over 20 years, while the others, though less experienced, had accompanied me on dozens of successful camping trips throughout the state. We weren't naive city dwellers venturing unprepared into dangerous territory. We were knowledgeable campers who understood mountain safety, carried appropriate gear, and had carefully planned our trip to one of our favorite remote locations in the Bighorn National Forest. We had chosen a dispersed camping area approximately 12 miles from the nearest maintained road, accessible only by a rough four-wheel drive track that discouraged casual visitors and ensured the kind of solitude we sought for our annual fall camping expedition. The location was a small meadow beside a crystal-clear mountain stream, surrounded by dense stands of aspen and pine trees that provided both privacy and protection from the mountain winds. We had camped in this exact spot 3 times over the previous 5 years, without encountering any problems beyond the usual challenges of backcountry camping, like afternoon thunderstorms, curious wildlife, and the occasional equipment malfunction. We arrived at our campsite on Friday afternoon and spent several hours setting up our camp according to well-established routines that had been refined through years of trips together. We erected 2 large tents, one for each couple, arranged our cooking area at a safe distance from our sleeping quarters, and properly stored our food in bear-proof containers positioned downwind from our camp. Anna and I were meticulous about following leave no trace principles and wilderness safety protocols, ensuring that our presence in the remote area would have minimal environmental impact and maximum safety for our group. The first indication that our weekend would be anything but peaceful came on Friday evening as we were gathering firewood around our campsite. Liam, who had been searching for fallen branches at the edge of the meadow, returned to camp with a disturbed expression and reported that he had found something strange hanging from a tree on the opposite side of the valley, approximately half a mile from our location. Initially, we weren't concerned about the presence of other people in the area. The national forest was public land, and we had no exclusive claim to the region. However, what bothered me was that we hadn't seen any tire tracks or other signs of vehicle access that would indicate how other campers had reached such a remote location as darkness fell, and our group prepared for bed. The distant object across the valley was joined by the flickering of at least 2 additional lights, suggesting that a significant group of people had established a camp in an area that I knew had no established camping sites or vehicle access. More disturbing was the sound that began to drift across the valley around 10 in the evening. It was a low, rhythmic chanting, punctuated by what sounded like the beating of a drum, all completely inappropriate for the wilderness setting and in clear violation of the quiet that applied to national forest lands. The sounds continued intermittently throughout the night, making it difficult for us to sleep and creating an atmosphere of unease that was completely foreign to our previous experiences in the area. Saturday morning brought a direct discovery that would escalate the situation from mere annoyance to genuine terror. As I was preparing breakfast for our group, Chloe returned from a short walk with a pale expression and reported that she had found a small, human-shaped effigy made of sticks and twine hanging from a tree just outside our campsite. The men were dressed in what looked like old, worn-out hunting clothes and appeared to be in their 20s or 30s, with an aggressive demeanor that immediately put me on high alert. They claimed to be part of a private hunting club and demanded to know what our group was doing in their territory, speaking as if they had some official authority over the public lands where both groups were camping. I, drawing on my years of experience dealing with various personalities in wilderness settings, attempted to diffuse the situation by politely explaining that our group had proper permits for dispersed camping in the national forest and had been using this particular area for years without any conflicts. However, the 3 men became increasingly hostile when I refused to acknowledge their claimed authority over the area, insisting that our group was interfering with important activities and should relocate to a different camping area immediately. The confrontation became more threatening when one of the men made pointed references to Anna by name, despite never having been introduced to our group, suggesting that they had been watching our campsite and gathering information about its occupants. The realization that our group had been under surveillance by unknown individuals was deeply unsettling for all of us, but the situation became genuinely frightening when the 3 men made it clear that they knew details about our planned activities and departure schedule. They referenced our planned hike to a nearby lake, mentioned specific gear that that Chloe had been seen using, and demonstrated knowledge of our vehicle and license plate number. This level of detailed surveillance suggested that the men had been watching our campsite for an extended period and had been gathering intelligence with a thoroughness that went far beyond casual observation. After the three men left, ostensibly returning to their own camp across the valley, we faced a difficult decision about whether to abandon our planned weekend and evacuate the area immediately. The men hadn't made any direct threats of violence, but their aggressive behavior claimed authority over public lands, and obvious surveillance of our group created a situation that felt increasingly dangerous. The presence of our partners complicated any decision to leave, as breaking camp and hiking 12 miles to our vehicle in unfamiliar terrain would be challenging and potentially dangerous, especially if we were being pursued or harassed by hostile individuals who knew the area well. Our group decided to remain in our campsite, but implemented security measures that we had never needed during previous camping trips. We consolidated our 2 tents into a single larger tent where the entire group could sleep together, moved our vehicle keys and satellite communication device to easily accessible locations, and established a watch schedule to ensure that someone was always awake and alert throughout the night. I also made the difficult decision to arm myself with the bear spray and hiking axe that I carried for emergency situations. Despite having never imagined that I might need to defend our group from other humans, in a wilderness setting, Saturday night brought a systematic campaign of harassment that would transform our peaceful camping trip into a nightmare of psychological terror. Beginning around midnight, our group was subjected to a coordinated assault on our sense of security that was clearly designed to maximize fear while avoiding actions that could be definitively classified as criminal behavior. The harassment began with sounds: footsteps circling our tent, branches breaking in the darkness around our campsite, and what sounded like whispered conversations just beyond the range of our flashlights. The psychological pressure intensified when the harassment escalated to direct interference with our campsite and equipment. Someone began to pull on the guidelines of our tent, causing the structure to sway and creating the terrifying sensation that our only shelter was about to collapse. When I emerged from the tent with my flashlight and axe to confront whoever was harassing our group, I found no one visible, but discovered that several items had been moved around our campsite. Chairs had been rearranged, our cooler had been opened and closed, and our firewood had been scattered across the meadow. The most terrifying aspect of the night was the realization that multiple individuals were involved in the harassment, and that they were operating with complete confidence that they could terrorize our group without facing any consequences. When I shouted demands that the harassers identify themselves and leave our group alone, I was answered by laughter from multiple directions, making it clear that at least 4 or 5 people were surrounding our campsite and coordinating their activities to maximize the psychological impact on their victims. The harassment continued throughout the night with a methodical persistence that suggested experience in psychological intimidation. Our tormentors took turns making noise, moving our equipment, and creating the impression that our campsite was completely surrounded by hostile individuals who could approach at will. Chloe and Anna were terrified to the point of hysteria, while Liam and I struggled to maintain composure in a situation that challenged everything we had been taught about wilderness safety and human decency by dawn on Sunday morning. Our group was exhausted, traumatized, and facing the sobering reality that we were completely vulnerable to individuals who had demonstrated both the ability and willingness to terrorize us with impunity. The harassment had continued throughout the night without any reduction in intensity, suggesting that our tormentors had no intention of losing interest or moving on to other activities. More disturbing was the growing realization that the individuals harassing us knew the area well enough to move through the forest in complete darkness without making unnecessary noise until they wanted to be heard. The decision to evacuate our campsite and attempt to reach safety was complicated by the fact that our tormentors had demonstrated the ability to surround and monitor our camp, suggesting that any attempt to leave would be observed and potentially intercepted. However, remaining in our current location had clearly become untenable, especially with our partners showing signs of severe psychological trauma from the night's events. I made the difficult choice to break camp in broad daylight, reasoning that our harassers would be less likely to engage in direct confrontation during daylight hours, when their actions would be more visible and harder to deny if reported to authorities. The evacuation became a desperate 12-mile hike through mountain terrain while carrying camping gear and trying to maintain the composure necessary to keep our frightened partners moving towards safety. Our tormentors continued to follow us throughout the morning, maintaining just enough distance to avoid direct confrontation, while making it clear that we were still being observed and tracked. The psychological pressure of knowing we were being pursued through the wilderness transformed what should have been a manageable hike into a desperate flight from predators who seemed to view the remote forest as their personal hunting ground. The most disturbing aspect of our escape was the realization that our pursuers were toying with us rather than simply following. Several times during the hike, our group spotted individuals positioned ahead of us on the trail, suggesting that our harassers knew the area well enough to predict our route and move through the forest faster than people following established paths. The pursuers weren't just following, they were demonstrating complete control over the situation and making it clear that our escape was only possible because they were allowing it. Our group finally reached our vehicle in the early afternoon, exhausted and traumatized, but physically unharmed. Our immediate report to park rangers and local law enforcement initiated an investigation of the area where we had been camping, but no trace of our harassers was found. The rangers took the report seriously and increased patrols in the remote area. But no arrests were made, and no similar incidents were reported by other campers. In the following weeks, the official investigation concluded that our group had likely encountered local individuals who were using remote areas of the national forest for illegal activities and viewed campers as potential threats to their operations. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not just the systematic nature of the harassment, but the complete impunity with which it was carried out against a group of 4 people. The individuals who terrorized us demonstrated an intimate knowledge of the local terrain, suggesting they were either locals who knew the area well or people who had been operating in the region for extended periods. The coordination and persistence of their harassment suggested experience in psychological intimidation, raising questions about whether this was an isolated incident or part of a pattern of predatory behavior targeting vulnerable families in remote areas. The psychological impact on our group was profound and lasting. Chloe, the youngest, required months of counseling to overcome the trauma of the experience and still refuses to participate in camping trips. Liam and I both reported difficulty sleeping for weeks afterward, with nightmares involving being pursued through dark forests by unseen attackers. Our relationship with wilderness recreation was permanently altered. We now camp only in developed campgrounds with established security and nearby ranger stations. Having lost the sense of safety and peace that had drawn us to remote areas in the first place, Anna and I struggled with guilt over exposing our friends to such trauma, questioning whether our love of backcountry camping had placed our group in unnecessary danger. The experience challenged our fundamental assumptions about wilderness safety and the types of threats that people might encounter in remote natural areas. We had prepared for wildlife encounters, weather emergencies, and equipment failures, but had never imagined that we might need to defend our group from systematic psychological warfare conducted by other humans in what we had always considered a safe and peaceful environment. The case highlights a reality that many outdoor enthusiasts prefer not to acknowledge. Remote wilderness areas can provide perfect cover for individuals who view isolated campers as easy targets for harassment, intimidation, or worse. The very isolation that makes backcountry camping appealing also makes campers completely dependent on the goodwill of anyone they encounter. When that goodwill is absent, when people encounter individuals who view remote areas as places where normal social rules don't apply, the result can be psychological terror that transforms peaceful natural settings into landscapes of fear and vulnerability. In Wyoming's Bighorn Mountains, our group learned that the greatest danger in the wilderness isn't always the mountain environment itself. Sometimes it's people who treat remote areas as hunting grounds where they can terrorize victims with complete impunity. Our story serves as a sobering reminder that when people venture far enough from civilization, find true solitude. They enter a realm where their safety depends entirely on the intentions of anyone else who might be sharing that isolated space with them. The mountains that had promised us peace and friendship instead became the setting for a nightmare that would haunt us for years, demonstrating that sometimes the most beautiful and remote places on Earth can hide the darkest aspects of human nature. Deep within the timber-scarred mountains of Washington, where generations of logging have carved an intricate network of roads and mills into the ancient Cascade bedrock, the Peterson family has been disappearing one by one for over 60 years. The pattern is so methodical and deliberate that local law enforcement has quietly stopped investigating new cases. This is the story of a generational curse that has claimed at least 12 of my family members across 4 decades, transforming the abandoned logging infrastructure of the rural Pacific Northwest into a hunting ground where someone or something has been systematically stalking and killing members of my bloodline with a patience and persistence that defies rational explanation. The Peterson family had deep roots in the mountains of Skagit County, dating back to the early 1900s, when Scandinavian immigrants arrived to work the timber that would fuel America's expansion for the next century. Like many logging families, the Petersons lived hard lives marked by dangerous work, economic uncertainty, and the ever-present threat of falling trees, equipment failure, and the lung diseases that claimed loggers with depressing regularity. My great-grandfather, Lars Peterson, had worked the forests for 37 years before a logging accident in 1962 left him permanently disabled and dependent on a modest pension that barely supported his wife Ingrid and their 4 adult children, who had remained in the area. The first disappearance occurred in September 1963, when my great-uncle Patrick, Lars's eldest son, and a 28-year-old logger following in his father's footsteps, failed to return home after his shift at the Cascade Timber Company's mill complex near Concrete. Patrick's disappearance initially attracted little attention from authorities, who assumed he had simply abandoned his family and logging job for better opportunities elsewhere. A common occurrence in the economically depressed region, where young men frequently left without notice to seek work in distant cities. However, our family knew that something more sinister had occurred because he had left behind his entire week's wages, his cherished fishing gear, and detailed plans for a fishing trip with his brothers scheduled for the following weekend. The search for Patrick was hampered by the complex geography of the logging region, where thousands of abandoned logging roads, processing facilities, and access trails created a wilderness maze that stretched for hundreds of miles beneath the mountains. Local search teams focused their efforts on the active logging areas where Patrick had last been seen. But the abandoned portions of the mill complex were considered too dangerous to search thoroughly, due to unstable structures, rotting wood, and the constant risk of collapse that could trap or kill rescue workers. After 3 weeks of searching without finding any trace of Patrick, the official investigation was quietly suspended, and the case was classified as a voluntary missing person situation. The second disappearance came 18 months later, when Patrick's younger brother, Michael, vanished under almost identical circumstances. Michael, 25, had been working the night shift at a different mill in the same complex when he disappeared sometime between leaving work at 6 in the morning and his expected arrival home at 7 in the morning. His car was found parked at a roadside diner halfway between the mill and his house, with his wallet, keys, and logging equipment still inside, but no signs of a struggle or indication of where he might have gone. The timing and circumstances of Michael's disappearance were so similar to Patrick's that even skeptical local authorities began to suspect that the Peterson family was being targeted by someone with intimate knowledge of their routines and habits. Pattern became unmistakable in 1967 when my great-aunt Catherine disappeared while walking home from her job at the company store in downtown Concrete. Catherine, 23 and recently married, had followed the same route home every evening for 2 years without incident. But on March 15th, she simply vanished during the half-mile walk between the store and her house. Her purse was found the next morning beside an abandoned logging flume, but there was no other evidence to suggest what had happened to her or who might have been responsible for her disappearance. The discovery location was particularly ominous because the flume led to a section of the forest that had been clear-cut since the 1940s due to a series of fatal accidents as news of the disappearances spread through the tight-knit logging community. A disturbing pattern emerged from conversations with other families in the region. Several people reported seeing my family members in the company of an unidentified man during the days or weeks before their disappearances. The man was described consistently as middle-aged, wearing logging clothes, and possessing an intimate knowledge of local timber operations and family histories. However, no one could identify him as a current or former employee of any of the timber companies operating in the area, and his apparent familiarity with families and locations suggested someone who had been observing the community for an extended period. The most chilling aspect of these witness accounts was that the mysterious man seemed to appear only in connection with the Peterson family, as if he was specifically targeting them rather than opportunistically preying on vulnerable individuals throughout the community. Several witnesses reported seeing him engaged in friendly conversation with Peterson family members, suggesting that they trusted him and had no reason to fear his presence. This pattern indicated that whoever was responsible for the disappearances was skilled at gaining the confidence of his victims and patient enough to establish relationships before striking. The fourth disappearance occurred in 1969 when Lars's youngest son, Thomas, only 19 years old, vanished while hunting in the mountains near several abandoned logging sites. Thomas had been an experienced outdoorsman who knew the local terrain intimately, making it unlikely that he had simply gotten lost or suffered an accident in familiar territory. His hunting rifle was found 3 days later in an abandoned mill yard approximately 5 miles from where he had last been seen. But there was no sign of Thomas himself or any evidence to explain how his weapon had ended up in such a remote location. The deliberate placement of the rifle in an abandoned mill suggested that whoever was responsible for the disappearances was using the extensive industrial infrastructure as both a hunting ground and a disposal site. By 1970, my great-grandfather had lost 4 members of his family to unexplained disappearances, and the remaining family members were living in a state of constant terror. Lars, now confined to a wheelchair and suffering from advanced respiratory disease, became convinced that his family was the victim of a deliberate campaign of persecution connected to some unknown incident from his logging career. He spent his final months obsessively reviewing company records, union documents, and local newspaper archives, searching for clues about who might harbor such intense hatred for his family that they would systematically murder his children. Over a period of years, Lars's desperate research uncovered references to a mill fire in 1943 that had killed 7 workers in a section of the mill where he had worked as a young man. The fire had been caused by faulty safety equipment and poor ventilation, but the company had covered up the true causes and blamed the deaths on worker negligence to avoid liability. Lars discovered that he had been one of only 3 workers who possessed detailed knowledge of the safety violations that had led to the fire, and that he had been pressured by company officials to remain silent about what he had witnessed in exchange for continued employment and eventual supervisory positions. The implications of his research were terrifying. If someone connected to the 1943 mill fire was responsible for targeting his family, it suggested a level of patience and methodical planning that spanned decades. The systematic nature of the disappearances, the intimate knowledge of family routines, and the consistent use of abandoned logging infrastructure all pointed to someone with deep connections to the local timber industry and a personal grudge that had been festering for nearly 30 years. Lars Peterson died in 1971 without ever learning the identity of his family's tormentor. But the disappearances continued with clockwork regularity. His widow, Ingrid, vanished in 1973 while visiting Catherine's grave in the local cemetery. Her car was found running with a door open beside a logging road that had been closed for decades. But recent tire tracks suggested that someone had been using the site regularly. Ingrid's disappearance was particularly disturbing because she had been under informal police protection and had avoided leaving her house alone for months before her death. The pattern continued into the second generation, as the children and grandchildren of the original victims began reaching adulthood. In 1978, Patrick's son, Kevin, disappeared while working as a security guard at one of the few remaining active mills in the area. His uniform and equipment were found arranged in a ritualistic pattern at the entrance to an abandoned lumber yard, suggesting that the disappearances had evolved from simple murders into something more elaborate and ceremonial. The symbolic nature of Kevin's disappearance indicated that whoever was responsible had developed an increasingly complex relationship with their crimes over the 15 years. Since the killings had begun, the most recent confirmed disappearance occurred in 1981, when Michael's daughter, Jennifer, 21, vanished while attending community college in Seattle, 2 hours away from the family's traditional logging community. The fact that the killer had tracked Jennifer to a distant city and successfully abducted her without leaving evidence suggested sophisticated planning and resources that went far beyond the capabilities of a single disturbed individual. Jennifer's disappearance also marked a geographic expansion of the threat, indicating that distance from the logging region would not provide safety for surviving Peterson family members. Local law enforcement's response to the Peterson disappearances evolved from active investigation to resigned acceptance over the nearly 2 decades during which the crimes occurred. Early cases received thorough attention from county sheriff's deputies and state police investigators, but as the pattern became established and no arrests were made, official interest waned and resources were redirected to cases that seemed more solvable. By the late 1970s, Peterson family disappearances were processed as routine paperwork rather than urgent criminal investigations, with investigators privately acknowledging that they had no realistic hope of identifying or apprehending the perpetrator. The unofficial law enforcement consensus was that the Peterson killings were the work of someone with intimate knowledge of local geography, logging operations, and family histories, possibly a current or former mill employee who had been planning and executing the murders for decades. However, the complete absence of physical evidence, witnesses, or mistakes by the perpetrator suggested a level of criminal sophistication that seemed inconsistent with the profile of a typical logging community resident. The methodical nature of the crimes and the long-term planning involved indicated someone with patience and resources that transcended normal criminal motivations. The psychological impact on my surviving family members was devastating and long-lasting. Those who remained in the area lived in constant fear, altering their daily routines, avoiding isolated locations, and maintaining informal buddy systems to reduce their vulnerability to attack. Several family members relocated to distant states, but Jennifer's disappearance in Seattle demonstrated that geographic distance provided no guaranteed protection from whoever was hunting them. The knowledge that they were being systematically stalked by an unknown enemy created a psychological atmosphere of helplessness and paranoia that poisoned every aspect of their lives. The broader logging community was also affected by the Peterson disappearances, as residents realized that if such systematic persecution could be conducted against one family with complete impunity, no one was truly safe from similar attacks. The crimes contributed to the already declining population of the region, as families chose to relocate rather than risk becoming the next target of violence they had no means of preventing or understanding. The abandoned mills and processing facilities that had once represented economic opportunity became symbols of hidden danger and unresolved evil. Modern analysis of my family's case by criminal profilers and forensic psychologists has identified several characteristics that make it unique among documented serial killing cases. The multi-generational scope of the crimes suggests either an individual with extraordinary longevity and patience, or a conspiracy involving multiple perpetrators operating over decades. The consistent methodology and symbolic elements indicate someone with a deep psychological investment in the crimes rather than opportunistic violence. Most unusually, the complete absence of bodies or definitive physical evidence suggests disposal methods and operational security measures that exceed the capabilities typically associated with rural criminals. The case has attracted attention from researchers studying unsolved disappearances in former industrial regions, as similar patterns of unexplained vanishings have been documented in other areas where extensive industrial infrastructure provides opportunities for concealment and disposal of evidence. The combination of economic desperation, social isolation, and geographic complexity that characterizes logging communities creates conditions where systematic predatory behavior can continue for extended periods without detection or interruption. Contemporary law enforcement agencies have reopened several Peterson-related cases using modern investigative techniques, but the passage of time and environmental degradation of potential crime scenes have made significant progress unlikely. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of suspected disposal sites have revealed numerous anomalies consistent with buried remains. But the dangerous conditions in abandoned mills have prevented comprehensive excavation and recovery efforts. DNA analysis of available evidence has been hampered by the age and condition of physical materials. Though ongoing technological advances may eventually provide new investigative opportunities, the Peterson family disappearances represent one of the most persistent and methodical campaigns of targeted violence in American criminal history, spanning multiple decades and claiming victims across 2 generations, while leaving virtually no actionable evidence for law enforcement. The use of abandoned logging infrastructure as both a hunting ground and a disposal site created perfect conditions for concealment and operational security, while the economic and social isolation of the victims reduced the likelihood of effective investigation or intervention. What makes the case particularly disturbing is not just the systematic nature of the violence, but the apparent personal motivation that sustained the perpetrator's activities over such an extended period. The patience required to track and eliminate family members across decades suggests a level of psychological investment that transcends normal criminal behavior, indicating someone for whom the destruction of the Peterson family had become a life's work, rather than simply a series of opportunistic crimes in the timber-scarred mountains of Washington, where abandoned mills serve as monuments to industrial exploitation and economic collapse. My family discovered that some grudges can outlast the individuals who created them, passing from generation to generation like a hereditary curse that cannot be escaped through distance, time, or prayer. My story serves as a chilling reminder that in isolated communities where law enforcement resources are limited and geographic conditions favor concealment, systematic predatory behavior can continue for decades. While authorities struggle helplessly to protect victims, they cannot identify until it is already too late. The empty houses and unmarked graves scattered throughout Skagit County stand as testimony to the Peterson family's tragedy, while the abandoned mills that honeycomb the mountains beneath continue to guard their secrets with the patience of geological time. Somewhere in those dark tunnels, the evidence of a multi-generational campaign of murder remains hidden, waiting for the day when advancing technology or pure chance will finally reveal the truth about who spent decades systematically destroying a single family with the methodical precision of an industrial process designed to eliminate human beings as efficiently as logging equipment once extracted timber from the same Cascade bedrock. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, lovely souls. I hope this story brought you a moment of calm and curiosity. I'd love to know what part of the story stayed with you the most. Drop a comment and share your thoughts. I always love hearing from you. If you enjoyed tonight's journey, don't forget to like and subscribe so we can continue exploring these quiet moments together. Now, take one last deep, gentle breath. Get cozy and let the calm of the night carry you softly until we meet again.